She stepped off the coach with mud on the hem of her coat and a trunk that the footman nearly dropped on his own feet. Eleanor Blackwood said nothing about this. She looked up at Ashford Hall and felt something shift quietly inside her chest. Not admiration, and not fear, but the particular feeling of standing before something very large that had not yet decided what it thought of you. She had been hired by letter. 3 exchanges of correspondence, efficient and impersonal, arranged through a placement agency in Kensington that had placed her in 3 households before this one. The position was governess to Lady Beatrice Ashford, aged 11, daughter of the late Duke of Ashford, and younger sister of the current one. The salary was the most generous she had been offered in 6 years of working in other people's houses. The requirements were extensive. The household was substantial. She had accepted for one reason: money. Not from greed, since Eleanor had very little interest in anything beyond enough. From a clear-eyed understanding that a woman without a family fortune, without living parents, and without prospects of inheriting either, needed to save carefully and consistently if she was ever going to have anything she could genuinely call her own. A room she had chosen herself, a shelf of books she had bought with her own wages, a door she could close against the world when she needed to. The front door opened before she reached it. Clara, one of the young housemaids, stood in the doorway, with the expression of someone who had been waiting longer than they found comfortable. Eleanor was 3 hours late, the result of a broken coach wheel on the Guildford Road, and a stretch of Surrey countryside that had been thoroughly unhelpful about the whole matter. She had eaten nothing since 6 that morning. She thanked Clara and stepped inside. The entrance hall of Ashford Hall was designed, consciously or otherwise, to remind a person of exactly how small they were. The ceilings rose so high above the stone floor that the upper air was a different temperature from the lower, and a central staircase swept upward in a long, confident curve and disappeared into shadow. Along the gallery walls, a row of painted ancestors looked down with the uniform expression of people who had found the present company somewhat beneath their expectations. Eleanor looked at none of this for very long. She looked instead at the woman standing at the far end of the hall, near the drawing-room door. The Dowager Duchess Harriet Ashford was perhaps 62, though she had the posture of someone who had refused, at some point in her 40s, to be diminished by time, and had enforced that refusal with extraordinary discipline ever since. She wore charcoal gray silk that moved with her and almost certainly cost more than a month of Eleanor's wages. Her white hair was arranged with mathematical precision. Her dark eyes moved over Eleanor with the quick economical assessment of someone who has evaluated a great many people and has rarely had occasion to revise a first impression. Eleanor met her eyes and held them. "You are 3 hours late," the Dowager said. "The coach wheel broke on the Guildford Road," Eleanor said. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace. Lady Beatrice has missed 2 lessons as a consequence. I will make up the time." Eleanor paused for one careful beat. "Is there somewhere I can leave my coat?" The silence that followed had a texture to it. It was the silence of someone encountering a response they had not anticipated, and taking a moment to adjust. The Dowager looked at Eleanor, for slightly longer than was comfortable. Eleanor looked back. Neither moved, until the Dowager said something quiet to Clara, who materialized from a side passage and took Eleanor's coat, and then the Dowager turned and walked back into the drawing room and closed the door behind her without a further word. Clara led Eleanor upstairs. 2 flights and a long corridor that smelled of cold stone and old furniture polish, and then a small room at the very end with a slanted ceiling and a fireplace that someone, mercifully, had lit. Eleanor stood at it with her hands out for a long moment, letting the warmth reach her fingers while the room assembled itself around her. It was small. The wallpaper was old. The window looked out onto the East Park, where the oak trees stood bare and black against the gray November sky. But the fire was real, and the bed looked solid, and there was a shelf beside the desk that was exactly the right depth for books, and it was, by her standards, entirely adequate. She unpacked with the methodical calm she had developed over years of arriving in strange rooms. 3 dresses, hung in the narrow wardrobe. 2 pairs of shoes, placed side by side at the foot of it. Her father's Bible on the bedside table, the spine cracked and the pages soft with use. The small wooden box of letters on the shelf, letters from her father and from friends who had long since married and moved into other counties and other lives. And David Copperfield, the spine worn to a curve, placed on the desk where she could reach it easily. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the opposite wall for 30 seconds. Then she lay down in her clothes and went to sleep. Because it was nearly 8 in the evening, tomorrow was a working day, and she had been awake since before dawn. Lady Beatrice Ashford was not what Eleanor had been led to expect. The previous governess, whose references Eleanor had reviewed before the appointment, had described Lady Beatrice as challenging, spirited, and in need of firm direction. 3 separate letters from 3 separate sources described a child who tested boundaries, disrupted lessons, and had driven one governess to a premature resignation. Eleanor had formed a mental picture of a willful, difficult child who had learned that her position gave her power over the people employed to manage her. She was wrong about all of it. Beatrice was 11 years old, and she was not difficult. She was direct, in the total and unmodified way that children sometimes are, before the world teaches them to soften their edges. She said exactly what she thought, in precisely the words she considered most accurate, without any of the careful social padding that children of her class were usually taught to apply very early. She was not unkind. She was simply and absolutely honest, and most adults found this considerably more challenging than actual bad behavior. On the first morning of lessons, she sat across the schoolroom table from Eleanor and looked at her with open and unashamed assessment. "The governess before you cried every evening," she said. "Not during lessons. Through the wall at night. I could hear her quite clearly from my room." "That must have been upsetting for her," Eleanor said. "And for you." "It was dull," Beatrice said, with the considered certainty of someone who has thought about this carefully. "Crying is very dull to hear through a wall. You cannot tell what it is about, and you cannot do anything about it, and it simply goes on." She picked up her pencil. "Do you cry?" "Not often," Eleanor said, "and not, when I do, in ways that are audible to the household." Beatrice appeared satisfied by this. She looked at the lesson plan Eleanor had placed on the table. "Geography," she said. "I should tell you honestly that I consider geography almost entirely pointless. If I need to know where something is, we have a perfectly adequate atlas in the library." "Geography is not primarily about location," Eleanor said. She opened the book to a map of the British territories and turned it toward Beatrice. "Location is in an atlas. Geography is about why people live where they live, why they trade where they trade, why wars are fought on certain ground and not other ground, why certain cities grow rich and others decline. None of that is in an atlas. All of it is interesting, if you approach it correctly." Beatrice looked at the map. She looked at Eleanor. The expression on her face was the expression of someone receiving a genuinely unexpected answer and deciding, with some surprise, that it was a good one. "Show me," she said. Eleanor showed her. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had a clear picture of what the previous governesses had encountered and why they had found it difficult. Beatrice was not a difficult child to teach. She was a very difficult child to bore, and most of what she had been presented with so far had bored her profoundly, and she had expressed her boredom in the direct way she expressed everything else, which was fully and without pretense. Eleanor reorganized the lesson plans entirely, drawing in material that had nothing to do with the standard curriculum and everything to do with making the ideas interesting enough for a mind as quick as Beatrice's to want to pursue them. She argued with Beatrice. This was apparently novel. Previous governesses had managed, corrected, and directed, but arguing, genuine intellectual disagreement held as equals, had apparently not been attempted. Beatrice found it enormously satisfying. By the end of the second week, she was arriving at the schoolroom 5 minutes early each morning to continue whatever argument had been left unresolved the day before. The Dowager Duchess heard of this progress and summoned Eleanor to the drawing room on a Thursday afternoon at the end of the second week. She was sitting with her afternoon tea, very straight-backed, her expression calibrated to indicate that she was open to information, but not necessarily to good news. "I am told Beatrice is showing improvement," the Dowager said. "Lady Beatrice has a first-rate mind," Eleanor said. She required a teaching approach that matched the quality of it. Previous approaches had not done so. "She requires structure and discipline," the Dowager said, "not accommodation. With respect, Your Grace, a child with Lady Beatrice's particular mind requires both. Structure that does not engage her intelligence does not function as structure. It functions as an obstacle she will find ways around, but when the work itself is genuinely engaging, she applies herself with complete discipline and considerable pleasure." The Dowager studied her, Eleanor was accustomed to being studied in this way by employers, the measurement of a person whose opinions might be inconveniently independent. She met it the same way she met everything else. "You are very certain of your views for someone your age," the dowager said. "I have been working in this profession for 6 years, Your Grace. I have formed some reliable views in that time." Another of those measuring silences. Then the dowager set down her teacup with a small, precise sound that signaled the end of the meeting. "You may go." Eleanor went. She did not see the Duke of Ashford for 9 full days after her arrival. He spent most of his time in London, she understood, and his appearances at Ashford Hall were governed by estate business rather than any regular domestic schedule. When he did return on a wet Wednesday morning in the middle of November, she knew it only because of the change that moved through the household the moment his carriage appeared on the drive. Footmen quickening their pace, Clara walking in straight lines instead of wandering ones, Morton the butler materializing in the entrance hall with the combined expression of a man who is both very important and very anxious. Eleanor was coming down the main staircase with Beatrice when the front door opened. He came in from the rain. His traveling coat was damp at the shoulders, and he was still pulling off his gloves when he looked up and saw them on the stairs. Eleanor's first impression was of height. He was considerably taller than she had imagined, and of a quality of tiredness that was not the tiredness of a single bad night, but the kind that had settled in over months, visible in the set of his jaw and the lines around his dark eyes. Beatrice let out a sound of pure and uncontained joy. She launched herself down the remaining stairs at a speed that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat, and she threw herself at her brother with the full force of someone who has been waiting 7 weeks for the opportunity. He caught her with the ease of considerable practice and held her close for a moment, and when he did, the tiredness in his face was replaced by something entirely different, warmth that was genuine and immediate, and without any social performance around it. "Bea," he said, and his voice, which Eleanor had expected from his manner and his household to be composed and formal, was simply warm. 7 weeks, Beatrice said against his coat. 6, he said. It felt like 7. She stepped back and assessed him. "You look tired." "You always say that," he said. "Because you always are," she said, with the complete reasonableness of someone simply observing a fact. He set her gently aside and looked up at Eleanor, who had continued down the stairs at a measured pace and was now standing at the bottom with her hands folded. He looked at her with the same quality of genuine attention he had given his sister, not the social look that catalogues and moves on, but the look of someone actually trying to understand what they are seeing. "Miss Blackwood," he said. "Your Grace." Eleanor kept her voice entirely professional. "Good afternoon. Has Bea given you difficulty?" "None whatsoever." "That is surprising. She has made life quite difficult for the previous ones." "I know. Lady Beatrice told me herself on the first morning. I believe she offered it as context rather than a warning. We have got on perfectly well since." Eleanor paused. Lady Beatrice is an excellent student when given work that is actually worth her attention. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite interest, but close to both, a flicker at the corners of his mouth and in the quality of his attention. "Carry on then," he said, and walked toward the drawing room corridor. Beatrice watched him go, then looked up at Eleanor. "He does that," she said. "Goes to see Mother first. She requires it. He'll be in a worse mood after." "That's enough," Eleanor said quietly, and walked her to the schoolroom. She told herself she had nothing whatsoever to think about beyond the afternoon's lesson. She was not entirely successful at this. The library at Ashford Hall was a long room on the first floor of the east wing, with shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, a fireplace on the south wall large enough to heat the room effectively when lit, and 3 windows that looked out over the east garden. Eleanor first went there on a Tuesday evening in the last week of November, when she had finished everything in her room and found she could not sit still without something to read. Beatrice had shown her the library on her second day, enthusiastically and in some detail, pointing out the sections she found interesting and the sections she found useless, with the comprehensive confidence of someone who has spent her whole life in the room. Eleanor collected what she needed from the lower shelves and left without lingering. She went back the following evening, and the evening after that. By the 4th visit she had identified the 3rd volume of a Thackeray set she particularly wanted, spotted 2 shelves above what she could comfortably reach, and had been meaning to retrieve it for several days. She was stretching for it on that fourth evening, rising on her toes with her arm extended as far as it would go, and getting nowhere, when a voice said from directly behind her, at a distance considerably closer than she had expected, "Allow me." She stepped back. He reached past her without visible effort and lifted the book from the shelf and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said. "Thackeray," he said. He looked at the book in her hands with a slight expression of recognition. "My mother considers him morally unsuitable." "Your mother is entitled to her view," Eleanor said. "What is yours?" She looked at the book and then at him. He was standing at a conversational distance from her now, and his expression was one she was beginning to associate with him specifically. The genuine asking of a question, not the social performance of asking one. "I think he is honest," she said. "People very frequently confuse honesty with impropriety, because honesty tends to expose the precise things that propriety was designed to keep covered. The confusion is understandable. It is not, however, accurate." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him genuinely considering it, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually thinking about what she had said. "That is a considerably more interesting answer than I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Something careful," he said. "Something that wouldn't risk giving offense." "Safe answers waste everyone's time," Eleanor said, "particularly the person who gives them." He looked at her. The brief, slightly surprised expression she would come to know over the following weeks moved across his face. A smile that arrived and departed quickly, as if it was not entirely in the habit of staying. He walked back to his desk. She took her Thackeray and left. In her room she sat at the window looking out at the dark park and the bare oak trees, and told herself, with considerable and deliberate firmness, that she was a professional in a professional position, and that was the full extent of the situation. She opened the book. She read the first paragraph 4 times, without taking in a word. She put it down and looked at the ceiling. Then she made herself read it properly, and went to sleep at a reasonable hour. The evenings in the library began quietly, and became something she did not have a name for. They argued first about Dickens, which she had not planned. She made a remark aloud that she had not intended to make aloud, and he looked up from his desk across the room and asked what she had said, and she told him, and they were arguing about it for 50 minutes before either of them thought to notice the time. The argument was genuine, neither of them conceding anything they did not actually believe, neither of them interested in being right for the sake of social ease. It was the most interesting conversation Eleanor had had in 2 years, possibly longer. He was there the next evening when she came in. He looked up and said, without preamble, "I have been considering what you said about Dickens, and I believe I was wrong about one specific point, but right about the larger argument." "Tell me which point," she said, and sat down, and they were at it again. Over the weeks that followed, she discovered that he had opinions about nearly everything: literature, politics, the economy, the way the country was managing its obligations to the people it relied upon, and that those opinions were ones he had arrived at himself, often in disagreement with people of his own class, and that he was willing to be argued with about them, and genuinely changed his mind when the argument was good enough. This was rarer than it should have been, in her experience. She argued with him because the arguments were interesting, and because she had spent 6 years being professionally invisible, and had accumulated a great quantity of thoughts with nowhere to go, and he was apparently a person who found that interesting, rather than inconvenient. He listened to her, the way she had not been listened to in a very long time. Not with the polite patience that performs listening while waiting for the other person to finish. With genuine engagement, with the quality of someone who is actually changing the shape of their thinking because of what they are hearing. Eleanor found this almost uncomfortably significant. By mid-December, the library had become the fixed point of both their evenings, and neither of them discussed this arrangement, and neither of them examined it too closely, because examining it would have required doing something about it, and neither of them, for different but equally compelling reasons, was ready to do that. The Dowager Duchess noticed. Eleanor could see it in the slight additional formality that entered the Dowager's voice when she spoke to Eleanor in those days, and in the small arrangements she began making to keep Eleanor's evenings occupied. Twice she arranged for Beatrice to have visitors who required Eleanor's supervision. Eleanor noticed all of this and filed it in the part of her mind that catalogued things she understood but could not yet address. She was a practical woman. She reminded herself of this regularly. She was also, she acknowledged to herself, on a cold Thursday evening in mid-December, while sitting across a library fire from a man she had known for less than 2 months, becoming extremely impractical about one particular thing. She had tried the honest acknowledgement approach, where you see a thing clearly and name it to yourself and then put it away and move forward. The difficulty was that putting it away required a degree of willingness she found she did not possess. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. They both maintained, with considerable skill, the surface appearance of two people in a library who happened to be having an interesting conversation. Neither of them was convincing the other. The snow came in the last week of December, thick, deliberate, settling snow that arrived overnight and transformed the park into something white and enclosed and separate from the rest of the world. In the morning, the light through the library windows was different, slower, and more interior, and Ashford Hall became an island of its own. And in the quiet that belongs only to a snowbound house, something that had been building carefully for 2 months stopped pretending it was not there. The snowstorm that arrived in the first days of January was the serious kind, not the polite kind that visits briefly and lets life continue around it. It came with intention, and it stayed, and by the morning of the 8th, the drive was invisible, under 3 feet of compacted white, and the nearest village was unreachable by any means that a sensible person would consider. Ashford Hall became its own world, enclosed and quiet, and entirely cut off from the one beyond its grounds. Eleanor stood at the library window on the morning of the 9th, and looked at the white park and thought, with the clear, methodical attention she had spent her adult life cultivating, about exactly what she was doing, and what it meant, and where it was heading. The conclusion she reached, after a thorough and honest internal accounting, was that she had fallen in love with Edward Ashford. She arrived at this conclusion with something between resignation and recognition, the feeling of seeing something you have been watching approach from a distance finally arrive. She was not a person who surprised herself easily, and the feeling had not come suddenly. It had grown over the evenings in the library, through the arguments and the laughter and the long conversations about things that mattered, through the particular way he listened and the particular way he looked at her when she said something he found genuinely interesting. She knew what the circumstances were. She was the governess. He was the duke. He was carrying debt he could not cover without marrying money, and she had 3 dresses and 2 pairs of shoes, and a salary that, carefully managed, would sustain her independently for a modest life. The distance between them was not a social nicety. It was structural, it was load-bearing, it was built into the foundation of every room they stood in together. She turned away from the window and went down to the schoolroom to teach Beatrice mathematics, which she did well, because she was a professional, and she had always brought her full attention to her work, regardless of what was happening around it. But the house was snowbound, and the days were short, and the evenings were long, and the conversation between them had long since stopped being careful. In the 3rd week of January, Beatrice developed a fever. It came on quickly, the way fevers do in children. One afternoon she was merely restless and flushed, and by evening her temperature was elevated enough that the doctor, who arrived on horseback through the snow looking considerably put out, advised rest and warmth and close observation through the night. Eleanor sat with her from 9 in the evening, keeping the fire built up and the room at an even temperature, reading aloud when Beatrice was awake and sitting quietly when she was not. She had done this before, in other houses, for other children. She was good at it. Near midnight, the door opened. Edward stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, holding a candle he had clearly lit in some hurry. He had not combed his hair. He looked at his sister in the bed, and then he looked at Eleanor, and his face in the candlelight held the particular worry of someone who cannot bear to see someone they love in pain, and knows that there is nothing useful they can do. "How long has she been like this?" he said quietly. "Since late afternoon," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low and even. "The doctor came at 7. The temperature is elevated, but not dangerously so. She has settled into real sleep in the last hour. The fever should break by morning." He crossed to the bed. He looked at his sister sleeping. Her dark hair spread on the pillow, one hand curled near her chin, and he reached out very carefully and adjusted the edge of the blanket at her shoulder. Eleanor had seen this gesture before, or something very much like it. The gesture of someone who cannot do the thing they want to do, which is take the illness away, and so does the only small thing available, which is to make the blanket lie right. He sat down in the chair on the opposite side of the fire, not asking permission, not announcing his intention to stay, simply sitting down, as if it were the obvious thing, which it was. They sat in silence for a while, with the fire between them and the sleeping child, and the deep winter quiet of the snowbound house all around. "She is all I have left of him," he said eventually. He was looking at the fire. "My father. He died when she was 4. She was very small. He used to carry her on his shoulders through the garden in the evenings, and make up stories about the trees, giving them all names and family histories that went back centuries." He paused. "She has his laugh." Exactly his laugh. When she laughs properly, I think of him every single time. Eleanor did not fill the quiet that followed. There are moments that words shrink rather than fill. He looked at the fire for a while longer. Then he said, "I had not meant to say that." "People often say things at midnight that they had not meant to say," Eleanor said. "I find it is generally not a disadvantage." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that planned conversation has a particular shape to it. People say what they have decided in advance to say, which tends to be what is safe and expected. But in the small hours, beside someone else's difficulty, the preparation runs out, and people say what they actually mean. I find the second considerably more interesting, on balance." He turned from the fire to look at her. "You speak very directly." "I try to," she said. "Indirectness costs more than it saves, in my experience." "Where did you learn that?" "From my father," she said. She adjusted Beatrice's blanket at the foot, smoothing an edge that did not need smoothing. He was a clergyman. He believed the clearest possible statement of a difficult truth was itself a form of kindness, not cruelty. He was very clear about the difference. She paused. "He was a genuinely good man." "Was," he said. "3 years ago," she said. "A fever, as it happens." She looked at Beatrice, a more permanent kind than Lady Beatrice's. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you." She had arrived at the place with her grief, where this response came naturally, not as a performance, and not as a deflection. She had mourned her father fully, and continued to love him, and had built her life around the shape of his absence, and it was real, and it was hers, and it was not something that broke open every time it was named. They sat together through the rest of the night. They did not plan the conversation that moved between them during those hours, which was why it was the most honest conversation Eleanor had had in several years, and possibly the most honest one he had had in longer. He told her about the weight of the estate, not the financial specifics, not yet, but the feeling of it, the sense of carrying something much larger than yourself that was also, inescapably, yours. He told her about his father, and what the man had been, and about what it had been like to step into the title at 22, and discover that nobody hands you a map. She told him about the years before Ashford Hall, the different households, the different families, the loneliness she had managed so efficiently over 6 years, that most people who employed her had not known it was there. She told him about growing up in a country rectory with too many books and too few people willing to talk properly about them, and about what it was to spend her adult life being excellent at her work and entirely invisible as a person. He said, past 2 in the morning, with the fire very low and the house completely still, "I do not understand how you have stayed so clear about everything, after all of it." "Clarity was the only thing no one could take from me," she said. "I kept it very carefully." He looked at her across the sleeping child and the dying fire. "That is one of the saddest and most admirable things anyone has ever said to me." She looked back at him. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and the fire settled with a soft sound, and the snow outside the window was absolute and silent, and the whole of Ashford Hall was asleep, except for the two of them. Nothing happened. She wanted to be honest about that, in the way she was always honest with herself. Nothing dramatic occurred, no particular word was said, but something passed between them in that room and in that hour that was entirely real, and that neither of them would have been capable of honestly denying afterward. By morning, Beatrice's fever had broken. She woke at 7, demanded to know whether she had missed any lessons and whether she was behind, and expressed some concern about a mathematics problem she had left unsolved the previous afternoon. Eleanor told her everything was fine and that she should eat breakfast. Beatrice said that the fever had been very dull, and she hoped it would not happen again. Eleanor said that she hoped so too. She did not see Edward until the afternoon. They passed each other in the upper corridor near the east landing, and both of them stopped, and in the space between them was the previous night. Not anything that had been done, but everything that had been said, and the silence that had held all the things neither of them had said aloud, and the fire and the small hours, and the absolute honesty of people who had run out of the energy required to be careful. "She is considerably better," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She will be entirely herself by tomorrow." "Good." He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone who has something to say, and is choosing not to say it yet. "Thank you. For last night." "It is what I am here for," Eleanor said. The expression that moved across his face at this was slight but definite. A small, quiet disagreement. The expression of a man who finds an answer insufficient, but has decided not to challenge it at this particular moment. He nodded and walked on. Eleanor stood in the corridor for a moment after he had gone. Then she went downstairs to prepare the afternoon lessons. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Eleanor Blackwood had known before. She taught Beatrice mathematics and geography and history and the correct use of Latin verbs, and she did all of this well, because she was good at her work, and she brought her full attention to it. But the evenings in the library were something else. They were the part of the day she did not examine too closely while it was happening, because examining it would have required deciding what to do about it, and she was not yet certain what the right decision was. The conversations between them moved further in. He told her things he had apparently not told other people, about the pressure of the estate's finances and the options he had been presented with, and which of those options felt like surrender, about what he believed an aristocratic family actually owed to the people on its land, which was not, in his view, what the majority of his peers believed, about his mother, for whom he had clear love and clear exasperation in roughly equal measures, and about the difficulty of being managed by someone who loved you and was also comprehensively wrong about what you needed. Eleanor told him things she had kept to herself for years, about what it was to be a woman of considerable intelligence in a world with very few places to put that intelligence, about the particular loneliness of being known primarily by your function, about her father's study and the evenings she had spent in it reading whatever she could find and arguing with him about ideas until late at night, and how much of her adult life had been spent looking, without quite admitting it, for a version of that. In the library on a Thursday evening toward the end of January, he set down his book and looked at her and said, without preamble, "What do you actually want? Not from this position. From your life." She looked up. It was not a question she had been asked often. It was not a question she had been asked by anyone who meant it the way he appeared to mean it. "A place of my own," she said, "small. A garden, if possible. Shelf space for books." She thought for a moment. "People to talk to who do not pretend." He was quiet. "That is a very specific answer." "I am a specific person," she said. "You are," he said. He looked at the fire. "No one has asked me that question in my adult life. It is considered beside the point." "What would your answer be?" she said. He looked at her then, and the look was not the managed thing she was accustomed to from him in other contexts. It was entirely unmanaged. It was the look of a person who had stopped organizing their expression for an audience and was simply present. "I would want to be in a room," he said, "with someone who does not pretend, and talk about things that actually matter, and not spend every conversation calculating what is required of me." The fire was low. The snow outside the windows was blue-white in the dark. She should have said good evening and gone upstairs. She knew this. She had always known it. The clear-eyed practicality she had spent years cultivating told her exactly what was right and why, and what the cost of not doing it would be. She did not do it. She did not do it that evening, and she did not do it on the evenings that followed, and January became February, and the snow melted by degrees, and the world outside the house began to press back toward them, and Eleanor Blackwood was happy, genuinely, quietly, surprisingly happy, in a way she had not been in years, and had not expected to be again. She noticed it carefully. She did not look at it too directly, for fear of making it fragile. She simply lived it, which was something she had not done in a long time, the state of simply being in one's own life, without the calculating management of distance. She was careful, in all the ways that mattered. She was correct in her professional manner. She was everything her position required her to be. But the evenings were different, and they were hers, and she stopped pretending they were not. In the second week of February, the last of the snow melted. The world outside the house returned to its ordinary distances and its ordinary demands. And Eleanor, sitting at the library window on a morning in the third week of February, and watching the bare February park, noticed with the clear precision that had always been her strongest quality, that her body was telling her something she had not yet allowed herself to think directly. She sat with it for 3 days, turning it over, making absolutely certain, the way she approached all important things, with thorough honesty and no wishful thinking in either direction. She was certain. She sat at her desk on a Thursday evening, with her writing paper in front of her, and thought about what she was going to do, and what it was right to do, and what the difference between those things was, if any. Then she picked up her pen and she wrote. She wrote 3 pages in her small, careful handwriting, and every sentence was as precise as she could make it. She had always believed that the clearest possible statement of a difficult truth was a form of kindness, and she had learned that from her father, and she applied it now. She told him what was true. She told him clearly, and without embellishment, and without asking for anything beyond his knowledge of the fact. She told him what she thought he deserved to hear, and she told him that she had no expectations of him, and she told him that she was going to manage whatever came next, and that was not his responsibility. She told him she could not carry the truth in silence and feel at peace with herself, and that honesty between them had always mattered to her more than protection. She read the 3 pages once. Then she folded them into quarters, sealed the letter, wrote his name on the front, and went downstairs at 9 o'clock in the evening, when the household was at dinner and the corridors were empty. She walked to the corridor outside his study. She stood at the door for a long moment, with the letter in her hand, listening to the sound of her own breathing, and to the distant sound of voices from the dining room at the far end of the house. She bent down and slid the letter beneath the study door. She stood up. She stood very still for a moment, in the cold corridor, listening. Nothing. Just the house around her. She walked back upstairs. She sat at her window in the dark, and looked at the park, and tried to read, and could not. She thought about the letter under the door. She thought about what she had written, and whether she had written it well. She thought about the various ways it might be received, the different possible responses, and she was honest enough with herself to know that she did not know what he would do with it, which was part of why she had written it as she had, plainly, without drama, and without making his response the thing the letter was about. She went to sleep eventually, and was up at the correct hour in the morning. 1 day passed. She watched carefully, not anxiously, she told herself, though the distinction was perhaps thinner than she would have liked, for some shift in his manner when they passed each other, a changed quality in the way he looked at her, some acknowledgement in his eyes that the letter had been received and read. She saw nothing. His manner was precisely as it had always been, composed, warm when he spoke to Beatrice, quietly attentive when their paths crossed in the library. She told herself the letter had perhaps not been found yet, that it had been swept aside with other papers before he saw it. She told herself he was thinking, gathering himself, deciding how to respond. 2 days passed, then 3. On the morning of the 5th day, as Eleanor was coming out of the schoolroom, with an armful of lesson materials for the afternoon, Clara appeared at the far end of the corridor, and walked toward her, with the expression of someone who has been asked to deliver news they find uncomfortable. "Beg pardon, Miss Blackwood," Clara said, and stopped a little way away, as if physical distance from the message might reduce her involvement in it. "The Dowager Duchess asks that you attend her in the drawing room at once." Eleanor looked at Clara's face. Clara looked at a point slightly to the left of Eleanor's ear. "Thank you, Clara," Eleanor said. She set down the lesson materials on the schoolroom table, straightened her back, and went downstairs. The Dowager Duchess was not sitting when Eleanor entered the drawing room. She was standing in the center of the room, which was not her usual position, and her hands were folded in front of her, in the very precise way of someone who has prepared themselves for a conversation that requires absolute control. The room smelled of cold morning and the faint lavender of the Dowager's soap, and the curtains were pulled to let in the gray February light, and it was very quiet. "I will be direct," the Dowager said. "I find directness more efficient than its alternatives." "Please do," Eleanor said. Her voice was entirely steady. She had not decided this consciously, it was simply what came out. "I am aware of everything that passes through this house," the Dowager said. "Every letter, every conversation, every door that opens in the night. This is not an accident. It is the result of 30 years of managing a household and a family, and a situation that has required very careful management since the day my husband died, and left things in a state that could not sustain itself without constant attention. She paused. My son has obligations that are not small and not negotiable. His obligations are to this estate, to his name, and to the continuation of both, in a form that is worth continuing. They cannot be set aside for any private consideration, however significant that consideration might feel from the inside. Eleanor stood in the middle of the drawing room and looked at the dowager and understood, with the clear precision that was her best quality, exactly what she was looking at. She understood it the way you understand something when all the pieces that have been separate in your mind for 5 days suddenly arrange themselves into a single coherent shape. The letter had been found. It had been found before he read it. Your position here has reached its conclusion, the dowager said. I want to be clear that this is a reflection of the changed circumstances, not of your professional performance, which has been excellent. You will receive a reference of the highest quality, which you have genuinely earned. You will also receive your wages for the remainder of this month, and 1 additional month beyond, which I consider fair compensation for the manner of the ending. She paused. A carriage will take you to the London road tomorrow morning at 7. The room was very quiet. Has the Duke been informed of this decision? Eleanor said. It is a household matter, the dowager said. It does not require his direct involvement. I see, Eleanor said. I believe you do, the dowager said. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not unkind in any simple way. It was the expression of someone who has made a decision she considers painful but necessary, and is not going to apologize for it, because she genuinely believes it was right. You are an intelligent woman, Miss Blackwood. Intelligent enough, I think, to understand that certain things are not possible, regardless of what they mean to the people involved, and that the kindest thing, for everyone, is to see that clearly, and not fight it. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Thank you for your directness, Your Grace, she said, and she turned and left the room. She packed her trunk in 45 minutes. She had always been efficient with her hands, and efficiency was, at this particular moment, the only dignity available to her. 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, the Bible, the wooden box of letters, David Copperfield. She placed each thing in the correct position in the trunk, and she focused entirely on the placement, on the folding of fabric, and the fitting of one thing beside another, because the alternative was to think about the letter, and about 5 days of silence, and about the dowager's expression when she said it was a household matter, and those thoughts were not going to help her pack. Clara appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a long moment saying nothing at all, and her face said considerably more than anything she might have said out loud. Eleanor thanked her for the fire she had lit on Eleanor's first evening at the house, which had been a genuinely kind act, and Clara looked as if she might cry, which was more than Eleanor could comfortably manage, so she closed the trunk and turned to the window. The park was brown and gray and bare in the February afternoon light. The oak trees that had been bare when she arrived were still bare. At the very tips of the highest branches, barely visible from this distance, the first swellings of new buds were just beginning. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought about whether she should find a way to see him before tomorrow morning. She turned this over with the same careful honesty she brought to everything important. She considered the various possible versions of that conversation, what she would say, what she might hear, and she was honest enough with herself to see all of them clearly. If he had received her letter and chosen not to respond in 5 days, she would not pursue that, and if he had not received it, if the dowager had taken it before it reached him, then telling him now, on the morning of her forced departure, with her trunk in the hallway and a carriage waiting at 7, would be the action of someone with nothing left to lose, making a final desperate appeal, and she had too much respect for herself to do that. She would write again, she told herself, when she was steadier, from somewhere with solid ground beneath her. She did not sleep well. She was awake for most of the night in the narrow bed in the small room with the slanted ceiling, and she thought with the deliberate precision she could still summon even now. She thought about the letter, and about the dowager's face in the drawing room, and about the pieces that arranged themselves into the only picture that made sense. She thought about the months since November, and the library evenings, and the things said in the small hours beside a sleeping child, and the particular quality of his attention when he looked at her, and she thought about what all of that had meant, and what it meant now. She arrived at the only honest conclusion available to her. which was that, whatever the evenings had meant, and she knew what they had meant, they had been insufficient to overcome everything arranged against them, and she was a practical woman, and she needed to know that, and live accordingly. In the morning, she was downstairs at 6:45. The carriage was waiting in the drive. The day was cold and gray. The sky, the particular washed-out color of February in the south of England. Eleanor walked to the carriage without looking back at the front door of the house. She climbed in. The driver clicked the horses forward on the gravel. She looked out the window at the long drive lined with oak trees and watched them until the bend in the road took them from sight. She was going to her aunt's cottage in Oxfordshire. Agnes Hartley, her father's sister, lived near the village of Charlbury, in a small stone cottage with a kitchen garden and a cat and a spare room at the top of the stairs that she had offered Eleanor every Christmas for 3 years. Eleanor had always declined. She was not declining now. The journey took most of the day. She made her connections by herself, which she was accustomed to doing, and she sat in the various carriages and waiting rooms with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she looked out of windows at the English countryside, going by in its winter gray, and she did not let herself think too directly about any of it, because she needed to arrive at her destination with sufficient composure to manage what came next. She arrived at Charlbury as the evening light was failing, cold and tired, and holding herself with the deliberate uprightness she had decided, somewhere on the journey, was the right posture for walking into this. Agnes opened the door, looked at Eleanor's face with the thorough and affectionate attention of someone who has known her since childhood, and stood aside without a word. Eleanor came in. Agnes went to the kitchen. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table, and when the tea came, she wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth reach her fingers, and she sat there in her aunt's warm kitchen, with the cat watching her from the windowsill and the evening settling outside. They did not talk about any of it that night. Agnes understood, as she understood most things about Eleanor, that her niece needed the room and the quiet and the cup of tea and nothing else. The time for talking would come. It was not tonight. Eleanor went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay in the spare room under the slanting eaves and let herself, for exactly 1 hour, feel the full weight of what had happened. All of it. She was 24 years old, and she had no position, and she was carrying a child, and the man she had written an honest letter to had been 5 days silent, and his mother had put her on a mourning carriage. She let herself feel all of that, properly, and without pretending it was smaller than it was. Then she began to think. She had money. The additional wages the dowager had given her were genuine and would last several months if she was careful. She had the reference, which she had been promised was excellent, and she believed it, because the dowager had been honest with her in the way that ruthless people sometimes are, when they are not lying about the thing they are being ruthless about. She had Agnes, who was not wealthy, but was generous and would not turn her out. She had her training, and her competence, and the 6 years of professional experience, and finding a new position would be complicated, but not impossible. She thought about writing to him. She thought about this for a long time. She had told herself she would write when she was steadier. She would hold to that. She turned onto her side. The cat had come in at some point and settled at the foot of the bed with a small sound of satisfaction, as if this had been the plan all along. Eleanor listened to the quiet of Charlbury outside the window, entirely different from the quiet of Ashford Hall, lighter, less charged, the quiet of a place that was simply itself and nothing more, and she made her plans in the dark with the same clarity she had always brought to the things that mattered, and eventually she slept. He came downstairs on the morning after Eleanor's departure, and Morton was in the entrance hall, with the careful neutral expression of a butler, delivering information he knows will not be welcome. Miss Blackwood had left the previous morning, Morton said, on the 7 o'clock carriage. Edward stood in the hall. He processed the words with the part of his mind that was always processing information, and then he processed them again, because they had not arranged themselves into anything sensible on the first pass. Left, he said. Yes, Your Grace. Was there an emergency? A family matter? I was not informed of the reason, Your Grace. Was there a note? Anything left for me? I was not informed of one, Your Grace. He went directly to his mother's drawing room. She was at her morning tea in her usual chair, with the composure of someone who has done what was necessary and has made her peace with it. Miss Blackwood is gone, Edward said. She gave notice on Tuesday evening, and departed yesterday morning," the dowager said. "It was all arranged without difficulty." She said nothing to me. He was looking at his mother, with a quality of attention he did not normally bring to bear on her face. He had known her for 32 years. He knew the texture of her management of things. He was looking at it now, with eyes that were slightly more open than usual. "It was a household matter," the dowager said. "The domestic staff does not require your direct management." "She was not domestic staff," he said. "She taught my sister." "Beatrice will have an entirely competent new governess before the end of March." The dowager set down her cup with the small, deliberate sound she used to signal that a subject was concluded. "Edward, Lord Wyndham has indicated in correspondence that he would welcome a conversation about Cecilia. I think the time may have come to move the matter forward." Edward stood in the drawing room and felt the conversation being steered away from the thing he had been about to press, steered with the efficiency of 30 years of practice, and he was off balance enough that he let it happen. He heard himself asking about Beatrice's lessons, and about the new governess, and about the London business that needed his attention, and he heard himself filling the conversation with questions that were not the question, which was where Eleanor had gone, and why she had gone without a word to him, and why 5 days ago there had been something in the library that he had been building towards saying, and now there was no one to say it to. He did not know about the letter. He had no way of knowing. It had been under his study door for less than 4 hours before his mother had retrieved it, at 5 in the morning, holding a candle in the cold corridor, and reading the first 2 lines with the careful speed of someone who has made reading other people's correspondence a 30-year habit in service of what she considered the family's best interests. She had understood what she held on the second line. She had taken it to the kitchen and placed it in the grate, and watched it until there was nothing left. And then she had gone back to bed and lain in the dark and thought about what else needed to be done. Edward went to London that afternoon for a meeting about estate accounts that required his presence and his attention, and which he attended, and from which he remembered very little. He had dinner that evening at his club with George Pemberton, who was his closest friend, and who had known him long enough to hear the things he was not saying. "The governess at Ashford Hall left," Edward said, over the soup. He had not planned to mention it. It simply came out, in the way that things come out when you have been carrying them all day. George looked at him with the careful attention he had been deploying on Edward for 20 years. "Left," he said. "Without notice, apparently. My mother managed it." "Your mother managed it," George repeated, in a tone that was entirely neutral, and somehow managed to ask a question, without technically asking one. "There are things she handles," Edward said. "She has always handled them. The house runs because she manages it." "Yes," George said. They ate in silence for a while. "The thing about people leaving without notice," George said eventually, in the voice he used when he was choosing his words with exceptional care, "is that it is worth understanding whether without notice means freely chosen, or whether it means something else." Edward looked at him. "I am not suggesting anything in particular," George said. "Only that certainty about why something happened, when you only have one account of it, is perhaps worth examining, before it becomes the story you have told yourself." Edward was quiet. "She was important to you," George said. "Not a question." "She taught Beatrice," Edward said. George looked at his friend across the dinner table for a moment, with the expression of someone choosing very specifically not to say the obvious thing. "Of course," he said, and reached for the wine. Edward did not follow the conversation to where it needed to go. He was tired. He was carrying the estate's growing financial difficulty and the increasingly urgent pressure of needing to do something about it, and he had other things pressing from every direction, and the thing that required doing about Eleanor required more of him than the others, required him to acknowledge what it was and what it meant, and what he had been building toward saying in the library, and he was not ready to do that. He told himself she had left by her own choice. He told himself it was done, and she was gone, and that pursuing someone who had clearly chosen to leave was not something he had the right to do. He told himself these things with considerable dedication, and believed about half of them. In the weeks that followed, he worked. He managed the estate and the accounts and the London meetings and the correspondence and everything else that needed managing. He hired a new governess for Beatrice in the 3rd week of March. A competent woman, named Miss Warren, who taught correct and unremarkable lessons, which Beatrice found, as she reported to her brother, almost entirely devoid of genuine argument. Edward told her that Miss Warren would improve. Beatrice looked at him with her clear dark eyes and said she was sure he was right. He met Lady Cecilia Wyndham for the first time in the last week of April, at a dinner at Lord Wyndham's house, where the arrangement had been made with comfortable clarity. She was 22 and elegant and composed, and she spoke to everyone with the same quality of even attention, which he found he respected. She was not unkind. She had a dry sense of humor she deployed precisely. She was, in every measurable way, right for the situation. He called on her 3 times in May. She received him with the directness he found genuinely appealing, and at the 3rd visit she said, without any social softening, that if they were moving toward a formal arrangement, she thought they should understand each other honestly about what that meant. It meant, she said, a practical agreement between 2 people who could benefit each other and who would treat each other with complete respect. She was not interested in pretending it was something else, and she assumed he was not interested in that either. He said he agreed entirely. She said she thought they could make it work. He asked Lord Wyndham for permission to court her formally. The engagement appeared in the Times on a Wednesday morning at the beginning of May, announced in the language that such things were always announced in, which managed to convey both importance and inevitability. In Charlbury, Oxfordshire, on a Thursday morning, Agnes Hartley came downstairs to find the newspaper already open on the kitchen table, and her niece sitting beside it, with her hands in her lap, looking at the announcement with an expression Agnes found very difficult to see. Eleanor sat with the newspaper for a moment. Then she set it aside and said nothing. She went upstairs. She did not come down again until 2 in the afternoon, by which time her color was even, and her expression composed, and she asked Agnes whether there was anything in the garden that needed attention, because the May afternoon was fine, and the physical effort would be useful. Agnes found a 2nd pair of gloves, and they went out together. Eleanor worked the beds for 2 hours without stopping and without speaking, and Agnes worked beside her and said nothing. And when they came inside, Eleanor ate well at dinner and went to bed at a sensible hour. She was 5 months along by June, and she made no effort to conceal her condition when she went into the village, which she did when she needed to. She held her head level and spoke pleasantly to people, and bought what she needed, and came home. Agnes had been entirely practical about it from the beginning, which Eleanor had expected and was grateful for. Agnes was the kind of person who dealt with the fact of a thing, rather than the social weight attached to it, and Eleanor had always found this deeply restful. She had written to the Kensington agency, explaining that her circumstances had changed, and that she was not currently seeking a position. She managed her money with the care she had always brought to managing things that mattered. She was not comfortable, but she was not in crisis. She was, she told herself honestly and regularly, entirely fine. She thought about writing to him. She thought about this several times. In the measured way she thought about decisions that had long-term consequences. She had told herself she would write when she was steadier, when she was on solid ground again. She was steadier now. The ground was as solid as it was going to get. But she did not write. She examined this honestly enough to understand it. What she was protecting by not writing was not anyone else's feelings. What she was protecting was herself, the part of herself that had decided, in the long nights at Agnes's cottage in February and March, what she was worth, and what she was not going to ask for, and what dignity required in her specific situation. She had been dismissed from his house at his mother's instruction, while he was in London, attending to other business. The engagement was in the newspaper. He had the resources to find her, if he had wanted to. He had not found her. That was clear. She looked at it clearly, and did not pretend it was something else. She had the garden. She had Agnes, and the cat, and the quiet of Charlbury. She had her books, and her clarity, and she had the child who was growing toward October, with magnificent indifference to the complicated circumstances of its arrival. She would manage. She had always managed. The summer was warm and dry, and the kitchen garden did well, and Agnes was the most comfortable sort of company, which was the sort that required nothing and offered something genuine. Eleanor read her way through most of the Charlbury lending library and had several interesting conversations with the vicar's wife, and taught herself the proper way to train sweet peas on a trellis. She was building a life of dimensions she had not planned for, and she was doing it with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She did not think about the library in the evenings very often. When she did, she was honest about what she found there, which was something real and true, and also, clearly, something that had been insufficient to overcome the weight of everything set against it. She filed this under the category of things that were real but that did not have a future, and she moved forward. She was very good at moving forward. She had had a great deal of practice. By August, with the summer light long over the Oxfordshire fields and the kitchen garden at its fullest, Eleanor had arrived at a state that she was willing to call, in her most honest private accounting, equanimity. Not happiness exactly, equanimity. A stable relationship with the facts of things as they were, without the burning quality of recent pain. She was building something, even if it was smaller than what she had once allowed herself to imagine. She was building it from her own materials, with her own hands, on ground she had found for herself. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. The child moved for the first time in early August, and Eleanor sat very still for a moment, with her hand over her side, and felt the reality of it, and thought, whatever comes next, this is real, and I am going to be equal to it. She was. On the morning of the 13th of June, the day before his wedding, Edward Ashford got up at 4 in the morning and went to sit in the dark at his desk in the Grosvenor Street Library, and he sat there without doing anything for 2 hours. He had not slept. He had lain in his bedroom looking at the ceiling since midnight, which was 12 hours after he had arrived back from dinner with George, and the rest of the evening at the club with other men he knew, and the dinner had been fine, and the conversation had been perfectly competent, and the whole of it had been entirely without the quality of being genuinely present with anyone in the room, that he had come to understand, over the past 6 months, he had apparently stopped being able to live without. He sat at his desk in the dark. He did not light a lamp. The Grosvenor Street house was quiet around him, the quiet of a city house at 4 in the morning, a different quality from the quiet of Ashford Hall, less absolute, but with its own character. He thought about the church tomorrow. He thought about the guests, the 500 people who would fill the pews of St. George's in Hanover Square and watch him marry Cecilia Wyndham, in the polished and careful manner of people who have arranged everything perfectly and mean everything to proceed correctly. He thought about Cecilia. She was a good woman. He had meant it when he said it to George, and he meant it now. She was intelligent and honest, and had been nothing but decent through the whole of the arrangement. She deserved the wedding tomorrow, and she deserved a husband who was entirely present for it, and he was going to give her everything he could of both, because that was what he had agreed to, and because she was worth that. He thought about the library. He stood up and walked to the window. The Grosvenor Street pavement was empty and wet from earlier rain, the gas lamps casting orange circles on the wet stone. A cat crossed from one side to the other with the purposeful confidence of a creature that belongs to the night and knows it. He thought about a specific evening in December, when the snow was deep in the park outside, and the library fire was low, and someone had said something very clear about honesty and impropriety, being different things, and he had looked at her across the room, and thought he had never heard anyone say anything so precisely true. He thought about a night in January beside a low fire and a sleeping child, when the careful management of himself that he applied to almost everything had simply run out, because it was 2 in the morning, and he was worried about his sister, and there was no one there but one specific person, and that person had said something about clarity being the only thing no one could take from her, and the feeling that had moved through him when she said it was not the feeling of someone hearing an interesting thing, it was the feeling of being known. He had been given one account of why she left. He had accepted it, without examining it as closely as he should have. This was a fact he had lived with since February, and would continue to live with, and what it said about him was not something he found comfortable to look at, but he had learned that looking at uncomfortable things was generally more useful than not looking. He went back to his desk. He thought about George's dinner conversation 2 weeks ago, when George had said, in the very careful way he had, that certainty about why something happened when you only had one account of it was worth examining. He had not examined it. He had chosen not to examine it, because examining it meant accepting that things were more complicated than he had been allowing them to be, and if things were more complicated he had a great deal to account for. The clock on the mantel showed 5:30. He thought about what he was going to do in 24 hours. He thought about standing at the front of St. George's and making a set of promises that were genuine promises and that he intended to keep, because he was a man who kept the promises he made, and so did Cecilia Wyndham. and that was the beginning and end of what this was. But at 5:30 in the morning, of the day before his wedding, sitting alone in a dark library in Grosvenor Street, the name that was in his mind was not Cecilia's. George Pemberton arrived at 10 o'clock for a breakfast meeting they had arranged around the business of the following day's arrangements, and found Edward in the dining room, with an untouched cup of tea, and the morning papers folded but unread beside it. George sat down across from him, and looked at his face, with the thorough attention of someone who has been reading that particular face for 20 years. "How did you sleep?" George said. "Not particularly well," Edward said. "You look it." George poured himself tea. "Is there anything you want to say to me before tomorrow?" Edward looked at his cup. "No," he said, and then, "Yes." George waited. "When she left," Edward said, "Miss Blackwood, in March." He was looking at the table. "I accepted the account I was given. I accepted it without pushing hard enough to understand whether it was complete." George was very quiet. "I told myself she had chosen to leave," Edward said, "that I had no right to pursue someone who had made her decision clear by leaving. And there was truth in that. I believed there was truth in it. But there was also," he stopped, "there was also the fact that the account I was given came from my mother, and my mother has a particular interest in certain outcomes, and I did not press her as carefully as I should have." George set down his cup. "Edward," he said carefully, "what are you saying?" "I am saying," Edward said slowly, "that I may have been wrong about a specific thing that happened in March, and that if I was wrong about it, the months that followed have been built on a false foundation." He looked up at George. "And I am saying this to you on the morning before my wedding." George was quiet for a long moment. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, particularly when what he was hearing required the kind of response that could not be taken back. "What would you do," George said finally, "if you discovered you were wrong?" Edward did not answer immediately. He looked at the window. The Grosvenor Street morning was clear and warm, the summer light already bright, and the city outside was going about its ordinary business in the way it always did. "I do not know," he said, "but I think I need to be honest with myself about the possibility, before tomorrow, not after." George nodded. He did not say anything immediately. What he said, after a long pause, was, "Whatever you decide, decide it now, not on the chapel steps." Edward looked at him. "Yes," he said, "I know." The day moved forward, as days do, without asking anyone's permission. Edward went through the things the day required. He met with his solicitor about some final estate papers. He called on the Wyndham house to speak briefly with Lord Wyndham about the following morning's arrangements. Lord Wyndham was gracious and practical, and entirely composed. Cecilia herself he did not see, in accordance with the convention, but he received a brief and characteristically direct note from her, confirming the morning's details, which made him appreciate her again, her directness, her complete absence of performance. He went back to the Grosvenor Street house and spent 2 hours with the accounts that needed reviewing before the week was out, and then he sat in the chair by the fireplace in his study, with a book he was not reading, and he looked at the fire and he thought. He thought about what he had agreed to, and what it was worth, and what his word was worth. He thought about Cecilia Wyndham, who had done nothing wrong. He thought about March, and about an empty study in the morning, and about a conversation with his mother that had been steered away from the question he had been about to ask. He thought about George's voice, saying that certainty, built on one account, was worth examining. He sat there for a long time. Then he went to bed. He lay in the dark with his hands folded over his chest, and he thought very precisely, and very honestly, about what he was going to do tomorrow, and what it meant, and what each possible version of tomorrow would cost, and what it would give him. And at some point, between 2 and 3 in the morning, he arrived. Not at a decision. He had not known until the moment it became necessary, whether it was truly a decision, or simply the only possible thing, but at a clarity. He went to sleep just before 3. He woke at 6. He was entirely calm, in the way that people are entirely calm when they have stopped fighting the knowledge of what they are going to do, and have simply arrived at it. Across the city, in the Wyndham house near Berkeley Square, Cecilia was awake long before the housemaids came to dress her. She sat at her window looking at the June morning coming in over the London rooftops, and she thought, with the honesty she brought to everything that mattered, about what tomorrow was. She liked Edward Ashford. She liked him clearly and without complication, in the way she liked a few people, those who were direct and intelligent and did not perform. She respected him. She thought they would manage the arrangement they had discussed without difficulty. She had meant what she said about the terms of it, that it would be honest and respectful and clear about what it was. But she was perceptive, and she had spent 5 months in relatively close proximity to her fiancé, and the thing she had noticed most consistently about him was the quality that she could only describe as an absence, not distraction. He was attentive and present in the social sense, but some portion of him was somewhere else, as if a significant part of his attention was permanently turned toward something she could not see and that he was not going to tell her about. She had not asked. It was not in the terms of their arrangement to ask such things, and it was possible, she told herself, that it was merely the weight of his obligations, the estate, the debt, the future, and nothing more personal than that. It was possible. She looked at the June morning coming in over the rooftops. She was 22 years old. She was capable and intelligent, and had refused 3 proposals over 3 seasons because none of them had been honest about what they wanted, and she had no patience for pretense. She had accepted this one because it was honest. She picked up her gloves from the table beside her and looked at them for a moment. Then she put them down and went to have breakfast alone and quiet, the way she preferred her mornings. Tomorrow she would marry Edward Ashford. She would do it well. She was good at doing things well. She hoped he would be entirely present for it. She had not yet allowed herself to wonder very directly what might happen if he was not. June the 14th was a perfect morning. The sun came up over London with the generous warmth of early summer, and by 9 o'clock the air was clear, and the sky was the particular blue that English summer produces on its best days, and the whole of Hanover Square was lit with it. Edward dressed. He stood in front of the glass while his valet attended to the details of the morning coat and the white gloves and the rest of it, and he looked at the reflection of himself and thought about nothing in particular, which was not something he often managed. He put on the coat. He pulled on the gloves. He checked the time. George Pemberton arrived at 9 and looked at Edward's face and said, "Ready?" "Yes," Edward said. This was not, perhaps, entirely true. But there was a kind of readiness that had nothing to do with wanting and everything to do with having decided, and he had decided, and that was its own form of certainty. They went downstairs. The carriage was waiting. The morning was warm and bright, and the streets between Grosvenor Street and Hanover Square were already beginning to show the particular crowding of a major society event. Extra pedestrians, extra carriages, extra of the small human activity that gathered around anything that promised to be worth watching. St. George's Church in Hanover Square was one of the finest in London, and it was dressed for a fine occasion. White roses everywhere, in arrangements that must have taken 2 days and a considerable fortune to assemble. The pews were already filling when Edward and George arrived, and the organ was playing in the patient way of church organs at society weddings, present but not insistent, marking time. Edward walked in, greeted the people who needed greeting, spoke the appropriate words to the appropriate faces. He felt distant from all of it, not unhappy, not anxious in the ordinary sense, simply distant, the way you are distant from a thing when another thing has most of your attention. He stood at the front of the church beside George, and they waited, as people wait at such events, and the pews filled further behind them, and the organ continued, and the white roses were very white in the summer light through the high windows. George said, quietly, very close to his ear, "The carriage is expected at 11. "I know," Edward said. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Edward said, with the same qualification as before. At 5 to 11, the practice was for the groom to step outside to the top of the chapel steps to receive the arrival of the bridal party. Edward had been told this. He had agreed to it. He walked down the nave with George at his shoulder and out through the church doors into the June sunshine. The chapel steps of St. George's ran down from the church door to the pavement below, wide and shallow, and worn smooth by centuries of occasions like this one. The square below was full of people, the gathered onlookers who had come for the spectacle of a society wedding, flower sellers and passing pedestrians, and small groups of people who had made a morning of it, standing along the pavement and the iron railings in the bright sunshine. Edward walked out into the warmth of the morning. He reached the top of the chapel steps. He stopped. The stop was involuntary. His body made the decision before his mind caught up with it. the way bodies sometimes do when they register something that the mind has not yet processed. He had stopped completely, one hand still slightly raised from the motion of walking, and he stood at the top of the chapel steps and looked across the square. She was standing on the far side of the street, slightly to the left of the main cluster of onlookers, in the gap between a flower seller's barrow and the entrance to a side street. She was wearing dark wool, plain and neat, and her hair was loosely pinned under a small dark hat in the way she had always worn it when she was not at work and not thinking about her appearance, which meant she was thinking about something else entirely. She was standing completely still, with her hands at her sides, not looking at the church, not looking at the crowd, not looking at the arriving guests or the white roses in the windows. She was looking at him. And she was visibly, unmistakably, obviously, carrying a child. The world around the chapel steps continued its ordinary business. George said his name at his shoulder, quietly, with a note of careful concern. Below in the square, a shift in the crowd's movement indicated the approach of the bridal carriage from the direction of Berkeley Square. The organ inside the church continued. The white roses held their places in the windows. He stood at the top of the chapel steps and looked at Eleanor Blackwood standing across the street in the June sunshine, and all of it, the month since March, every piece of what he had been given, and what he had chosen to accept, and what he had chosen not to press on, and what George had said about certainty built on one account, arranged itself in the space of 3 seconds into a picture that was entirely clear, and entirely terrible, and entirely unambiguously honest. She had not left by choice. She had written to him. The letter had been taken. She had been dismissed by his mother while he was at dinner, and she had been put on a carriage at 7 in the morning, and she had gone to Oxfordshire, and she had carried his child through the autumn, and the winter, and the spring, and she had not written to him, because she had been waiting to see what he would do when he was given the information, and what he had done was nothing. What he had done was nothing. She was standing across the street in the June sunshine, with the full fact of all of it, in her posture, in the way she stood with her hands at her sides, and her chin level, and her eyes on him, and she was not pleading, and she was not accusing, and she was not performing anything at all. She was simply being visible, and there, and honest, in the way she had always been all three of those things. George said his name again, with a different quality now. The crowd around the base of the steps was shifting as the bridal carriage came into view at the end of the square, and a sound of anticipation moved through it. Edward stood for perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps 5. They felt longer. Then he walked down the chapel steps. Not toward the carriage, down the steps and through the crowd, which parted for him with the slightly stunned reflexive courtesy of people who do not yet understand what is happening, but understand instinctively that they should not be in the way of it. George did not try to stop him. He said his name once more, very quietly, and in the tone he used, it was not a question or a command. It was simply the sound of a man who has understood what his friend is doing, and has decided, after approximately 1 second of internal debate, not to interfere. Edward walked through the crowd. He was not walking fast. He was walking with the particular deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it out, which is different from hurrying, and different from hesitation. The square opened around him, and the sun was warm on his morning coat, and the sound of the city was ordinary and present, and entirely separate from the thing that was happening inside him. He reached the opposite pavement. He stopped in front of her. She had not moved. She had not looked away, and she had not adjusted her expression into anything except what it already was, which was clear and direct and entirely itself, and it was the most familiar face he had seen in months. He said her name, just her name, with nothing arranged around it. She looked at him for a moment with the unmodified directness she had always looked at everything with. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and drew out a folded letter, the paper worn at the crease from being carried for some time. She held it out without speaking. He took it. He unfolded it. It was 3 pages in her small, precise handwriting, the handwriting he had seen on lesson plans and library borrowing notes and in the margins of books, and he stood on the London pavement in his wedding coat in the June sun, and he read every word of it. She had written to him in March. She had told him what was true, with the clean precision she brought to everything that mattered, and without a word of self-pity, or demand, or drama. She had told him she did not ask anything of him beyond his knowledge of the truth. She had told him she respected him too much to keep it from him. She had slid the letter under his study door at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening in February. He folded the letter. He looked at the pages in his hands for a moment, and then he looked across the street at the top of the chapel steps where his mother had appeared in the doorway of St. George's Church. He walked back across the street. And through the crowd, at the base of the chapel steps, which was no longer the ordinary wedding crowd. Something had shifted in it. The murmur had changed. The texture of it had changed, the way the air changes before a storm. Not the sound of a crowd watching a ceremony proceed correctly, but the sound of a crowd watching something unexpected happen. 500 people, and the open street beyond them, were beginning to understand that what they were witnessing was not going to be the thing they had come for. Edward walked up the chapel steps. The Dowager Duchess Harriet Ashford had come out of the church at some point in the past 5 minutes, and she was standing at the top of the steps in her charcoal gray silk, with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her. She looked at her son as he came up the steps toward her, and she did not look away. He stopped in front of her. He held the letter. He said, very quietly, because the crowd was silent now, and quiet carried further than it should, "I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly." She said nothing. "In February," he said, "a letter addressed to me, placed under the study door at Ashford Hall. Did you find it before I did?" The silence on the chapel steps was absolute. The square below was silent. The crowd of 500 people was the quietest it had been all morning, and the sound of the organ inside the church was the only thing moving, a slow hymn that no one was listening to. "I found a letter," the Dowager said. "What did you do with it?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at him with the expression he had known all his life, the composed and steady expression of someone who has made decisions she believed were necessary, and has not broken under the weight of them. "Mother," he said, "what did you do with it?" "I did what was necessary," she said. "What I have always done. What I have been doing for 30 years, since your father died. I managed what needed managing, in the interest of this family's survival." She paused. "You have obligations, Edward. Obligations that are real, and that matter, and that cannot be set aside for private feeling, no matter how significant that feeling is." "You burned it," he said. She was silent. He looked at her for a long moment. He was not shouting. He was not making a performance of anything. He was standing on the chapel steps of St. George's Church on the morning of his wedding, talking to his mother in the voice he used when something important needed to be said clearly, and what was in his expression was not anger in the hot, sudden sense. It was something quieter and more settled than anger. It was the look of a man who has understood something about a relationship he has had for 32 years, and is deciding, in real time, what that understanding means. "You had a letter written to me," he said, "by a woman carrying my child, and you burned it so that I would not know what was true." She held his gaze. "I did what the family required." "You decided," he said, "what the family required, without asking me." "You would not have decided correctly," she said. The quiet that followed this was the quietest moment Edward Ashford had ever stood in. He looked at his mother, she looked at him. They had been looking at each other for 32 years, and the looking had always had a particular quality, the complex quality of people who love each other, and also, in certain essential matters, do not see the same things when they look at the same world. He turned from her. Lady Cecilia Wyndham was standing 3 steps below him on the chapel stairs. She had been there for some time. Her expression was composed in the manner of someone who is processing information quickly, and who will decide what to show the world once she has completed the processing. Her eyes were entirely alert. She looked at Edward. He looked at her. She had heard everything. The square had been silent enough. She had heard the question he asked, and the answer his mother gave, and she had heard the word burned. And she was intelligent enough, and had been observant enough over the 5 months of their arrangement, to know what had happened, and what it meant, and what the specific quality of the absence she had noticed in him all this time had actually been pointed toward. She reached up and took the ring from her left hand. She held it for a moment, the June light catching it. Then she placed it, with the precise and deliberate care that characterized everything she did, into the Dowager's gloved hand. "I find myself," Cecilia said, in a voice that was very clear and very steady and carried to every person in the square below, "in possession of information that was not available to me when I agreed to this arrangement." She paused. "That is not your fault, Edward. I believe that entirely. And it is not mine. But I would prefer not to build a marriage on a foundation that was assembled with pieces missing from it. She straightened her gloves with a small, precise gesture. I think we both deserve better than that. She turned to her father, Lord Albert Wyndham, who was standing just behind her, with the expression of a man who is absorbing a very large amount of information very quickly, and whose primary response to this is composure rather than emotion, because composure had served him well for 60 years, and he had no intention of abandoning it now. Father, Cecilia said quietly. He offered her his arm without a word. She took it. They walked together down the chapel steps through the crowd, which parted for them with the stunned courtesy of people who are in the presence of something they did not expect and do not yet know how to respond to. Lord Wyndham handed his daughter into the carriage at the bottom of the steps and got in after her, and the door closed and the carriage moved. The crowd found its voice. It started in one place and spread the way these things always spread, a murmur building to a rush of sound, individual voices becoming something collective, and then something louder, and then the street beyond the square beginning to carry it, and then the whole of Hanover Square alive with the particular sound of a scandal that has just revealed itself publicly and completely. The vicar, Reverend Owen, appeared in the church doorway, with the expression of a man who has been a priest in this parish for 23 years and believes he has seen everything and has just been comprehensively corrected. George Pemberton appeared at Edward's shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very simply, "Go to her." Edward walked back down the chapel steps for the second time. The crowd parted for him again, differently now, with the charged energy of people who are watching history being made at very close range. He crossed the square. Eleanor had not moved from the pavement where he had left her. She was standing in the same position, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on him as he came toward her, and her expression was not readable in any simple way. It was too much and too varied to be one thing. It was the expression of someone who has been holding a great deal very still for a long time and is not yet certain what is about to happen. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I am sorry," he said, "for March, for what I accepted without questioning, for the months after it." He paused. "I have a great deal more to say than that, but I cannot say it here, not like this." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "not like this. Are you and the child well?" "We are both well," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her face, and at the letter still in his hands, and at the June Square full of 500 stunned and buzzing people, and he said, "I will write to you. Today. I will write to you, and I will tell you what I should have found a way to say months ago." "Yes," she said. Her voice was entirely even. He said her name again, quietly, just her name, with all the months behind it, and all the things that needed to be said later, in some quieter place than this. She looked at him steadily, with the same composure she had brought to the whole of it, the standing there, and the handing over of the letter, and the standing here now while the square erupted around them. And he saw in her face, beneath the composure, something he recognized. He had seen it in the library. He had seen it in the small hours beside a sleeping child. He had seen it in the way she disagreed with him, and the way she laughed, and the way she was, consistently and completely, herself. A carriage that Agnes Hartley had arranged to have waiting pulled forward on the pavement. Eleanor moved toward it. She did not hurry, and she did not look back at the church, and she did not look at the crowd. She was entirely focused on the pavement in front of her, and on getting into the carriage with her dignity intact, which she did. The carriage door closed. Edward stood on the pavement of Hanover Square and watched it move away. Behind him, across the square, the scandal burned bright and loud. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to find George Pemberton, who was the only person he wanted to speak to. The morning papers on June the 15th carried it in every edition, from the factual to the elaborate, and none of them had to elaborate very far, because the factual version contained everything required for a complete and spectacular story. The Duke of Ashford had walked away from his own wedding at the chapel steps and crossed the street to a woman carrying his child. The Dowager Duchess had confessed, on those same steps, to having destroyed a letter. Lady Cecilia Wyndham had removed her own engagement ring and walked away with more grace than the circumstances required of her. Edward read the morning papers over breakfast. He put them down and did not pick them up again. He had more important work to do. He sat at his desk, and he wrote to Eleanor. Not a short letter. Not a note about practical matters, and nothing more. He wrote the thing he had been building toward since the library in December, and had not said clearly enough, and had lost the chance to say, and had spent 6 months without saying. He wrote about the evenings in the library, and what they had meant. He wrote about February, and about his failure in it, and about what he understood now, about what had happened, and what his part in it had been. He did not ask for anything. He stated what was true about what he felt, and what he wanted, and what he was willing to do, to earn the right to say any of it again, and he sealed the letter and sent it that afternoon. Then he began dealing with the practical consequences of a morning that had changed his world in more ways than one. And there were consequences. He knew there would be, and he met them without surprise. 3 club memberships were suspended. Several social invitations that had been expected stopped arriving. 2 men he had considered friends for over a decade found reasons to be unavailable when he contacted them. The Wyndham arrangement was concluded, which meant the financial rescue that had been the primary practical purpose of the match was gone, and the estate's accounts looked at him from the page with the same patient difficulty they had always held. None of this surprised him. None of it, he found, hurt in the way he had once imagined it might. He had been inside the world of his social standing for 32 years. He had always known, abstractly, that it required him to perform a particular version of himself in a particular way. Now that the performance had ended, the relief was, oddly, larger than the loss. The things that had fallen away were things that had required him to be less than honest about what he was, and what he found without them was a simpler and more manageable set of obligations, all of them toward people who knew exactly who he was. George Pemberton came that evening, and they sat in the study and talked honestly about what had happened and what needed to happen next. And George said, at one point, "For what it's worth, and I know it does not fix anything, she was standing there. She came." "I know," Edward said. "She did not have to," George said. "She came anyway." "Yes," Edward said. He thought about that for a long time after George left. What it had taken to stand there. The composure it required to hold the whole of those months and do the honest thing with them, which was not to hide, and not to accuse, and not to make a scene, but simply to be present and visible and true. He wrote to her again the next day. He had told her he would, and he did. He wrote every day after that. The months that followed were not easy. This was such a significant understatement that Edward occasionally thought about it with something that was almost like dark amusement, though the amusement did not make the months easy. The scandal settled into London society the way such things do, like something heavy dropped into still water. A large immediate impact, and then rings spreading outward. The disturbance traveling further than you expect, and lasting longer than seems strictly necessary. By the end of June, the story had been told and retold, in drawing rooms and clubs and dining tables, across the city, in versions ranging from the approximately accurate to the thoroughly embroidered, and all of them agreed on the central facts, which were remarkable enough not to require embellishment. Edward Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had walked away from his own wedding and crossed the street to a woman carrying his child. The Dowager Duchess had intercepted and destroyed a letter. Lady Cecilia Wyndham had returned the ring. These things had happened in front of 500 witnesses on a perfect June morning, and people did not forget things like that. He did not expect them to. He had made his choices in clear knowledge of what they would cost him, and he met the costs without either complaint or pretense. The club memberships he accepted. The invitations that stopped arriving, he noted and set aside. The friendships that turned out to require his social standing, more than his actual company, he catalogued honestly, and found he missed less than he had expected. His mother went to Ashford Hall, and they did not speak directly for 3 weeks. This was the right amount of time, he decided. Not enough to suggest they were permanently severed, which was not what he intended, but enough to allow the immediate sharpness to settle, and for both of them to think clearly about what they needed to say to each other. He had loved her for 32 years, and continued to love her, and was not interested in severing that love. But there was a great deal that needed to be honest between them, before it could function properly again. George Pemberton was the steadiest thing in those weeks. He came regularly, and spoke directly, and did not pretend anything was other than what it was, and he was the only person Edward knew whose company in those days was entirely without performance or agenda. "You are managing," George said. on an evening in early July, over dinner at the Grosvenor Street house, with no one else present. "I am managing," Edward agreed. "The estate is more difficult now," George said, "without the Wyndham arrangement." "Yes, but it was always going to be difficult. I was borrowing against a future that was going to be straightforward, for reasons that had nothing to do with the estate being actually sound." He looked at his glass. "I would rather have a genuinely difficult estate than an artificially easy one that required building on something false." George considered this. "You sound as if you have thought about it." "I have had considerable time in which to think about most things," Edward said. He sent money to Charlbury through his solicitor in the second week of June, with a formal letter covering the practical provisions. He wanted Eleanor to have what she needed, without constraint and without qualification. He stated this clearly in the letter, and added nothing personal, because the personal things were being written separately, in the daily letters, and he was not going to conflate the two. He went to see his mother, at Ashford Hall, in the third week of June. It was the most difficult conversation he had ever had with her, not because she was cruel or defensive, though she was occasionally both, and not because what had passed between them was something he had not already thought about at length. It was difficult because she was his mother, and he loved her, and she had done something that had cost him, and Eleanor, and the child months that could not be recovered, and she had done it from love, from a version of love that had lost sight of the people it was supposed to protect, and both of those things were true at once. She did not apologize in any simple way. She was not a woman built for that kind of simplicity. What she did was acknowledge, slowly and with difficulty, that she had made a decision that was not hers to make, that she had treated Eleanor as a piece on a board to be moved, rather than as a person with rights of her own, and that the consequences had been what they had been. She said this with something in her voice he had not heard there often, which was the acknowledgement of being genuinely wrong, rather than merely unsuccessful. He sat across from her in the Ashford Hall drawing room, and looked at his mother, and said that he understood what she had done, and why, and that he could not excuse the means, and that he was not going to pretend he could, and that he also intended to continue being her son, because she had spent 30 years holding the family together, by sheer force of will and intelligence and devoted attention, and that counted for something real, even when it had gone wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was very level and very quiet, "I hope she makes you happy, Edward." "She makes me more honest," he said. "I have found that is better." Beatrice received the information about what had happened at St. George's Church with the direct equanimity that had characterized her approach to most things in her life. She asked 4 questions. She received 4 honest answers. She sat quietly for a moment, and then she said, "I always thought Miss Blackwood was very good. I hope she comes back to Ashford Hall, in whatever form makes sense." "So do I," Edward said. "Is the baby a boy or a girl?" Beatrice said. "I do not know yet," Edward said. "It will not be born until October." "I want to meet it," Beatrice said. "I will be an excellent older cousin." "I believe you will," Edward said. He went to Charlbury for the first time in the last week of June. He did not write ahead to warn her specifically of his coming, because he had written every day, and she knew he wanted to come, and he thought that the time had arrived. He took the train to Oxford, and hired a carriage from there, and arrived at Agnes Hartley's cottage on a Saturday afternoon, to find the gate standing open, and the kitchen garden in full summer bloom, and Agnes sitting on a wooden bench by the front wall, with a cat on her lap. Agnes looked at him for a long moment when he came to the gate. Then she said, "Come in then," in the voice of someone who has been waiting for a person to arrive, and has decided to be civil about the waiting. She led him through the garden to where Eleanor was sitting in the shade of the back wall with a book she had been reading. Eleanor looked up when he came around the corner of the cottage. She looked at him with the same direct, clear attention she had always had, and she did not perform a reaction in either direction. She was simply present, and she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and he had not seen her face this close since the pavement in Hanover Square, and that had been a charged and public and completely insufficient context for seeing her. Agnes found a wooden chair from the kitchen and placed it some distance from Eleanor's and disappeared into the cottage with the tact that was clearly her primary gift. He sat down. She set aside the book. He had planned a great deal of what he wanted to say during the journey. He had thought about it carefully, and now he was here, and the June afternoon was warm, and the Oxfordshire garden was full of birdsong, and Eleanor Blackwood was sitting across from him, with the straight back and the clear eyes he had missed for 4 months, and everything he had planned to say felt insufficient. He said the true things instead, which were not planned. He told her what he had understood on the chapel steps, and what he understood now. He told her what March had cost, and what his failure in it had been, and what he thought about that. He told her that he did not have an excuse for the months between her departure and the wedding morning, only an explanation which he offered, because she deserved to have it, not because it changed what the months had been. He told her that he had been a coward about the one thing that mattered most, and that the cowardice had come from fear, and that the fear had been of exactly the thing the cowardice had cost him. Then he got off the chair and knelt on the grass of Agnes Hartley's garden, and asked her to marry him. He told her he loved her. He said it plainly, without decoration, because that was the only way to say it that was worth saying. He said he had loved her since the library in December, and he had not said it clearly enough when it might have made a difference, and he was saying it now, because he was not going to be a coward about it again. He said he was not asking her to save anything, not the estate, not his reputation, not his standing in a world that was already considerably less concerned with his standing than it had been a month ago. He was asking her because his life was different when she was in it, and he had spent enough months knowing what it was like, without her to have a very accurate sense of the difference. He stopped talking. The garden was quiet. A bird sang somewhere in the hedge. Agnes's cat appeared from the direction of the kitchen door, and sat down at a dignified distance from the proceedings. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her. Her expression was the expression he had come to know, as the one she had when she was thinking seriously about something important, and had not yet reached a conclusion. "Stand up," she said. "You will ruin your trousers on the grass." He stood. "I need time," she said. "Of course," he said. And then, immediately, "I apologize. That was the wrong response. You do not need to qualify the time you need." She looked at him with the slight expression of someone who has noted something and is filing it away. "I am not saying no," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am saying that this is an important decision, and I intend to make it properly." "Yes," he said. "I will write to you," she said. Agnes provided tea in the garden, while the afternoon settled into early evening, and she spoke about her garden and her cat, and the Charlbury Village fete that was happening the following weekend, and she was entirely pleasant about all of it, and Edward was grateful for this because it gave him something to be present in while he waited for the afternoon to come to its natural end. He took the carriage back to Oxford and the train to London in the last of the evening light, and he sat in the carriage going through the summer countryside and thought about the grass stains that were probably on his trousers, and about the fact that Eleanor Blackwood had said she was not saying no, and about what it was like to have stood in a garden and said a completely honest thing to the person you most wanted to say it to. He had managed it. Whatever came next, he had managed that. He wrote to her the next morning. He wrote about the garden and the cat, and Agnes's excellent instinct for the correct moment to appear with tea. He wrote about what he was managing with the estate, and what decisions he was making with the accounts, and how Beatrice was getting on with Miss Warren, who was competent in every professional respect, and, as Beatrice had reported with affectionate resignation, thoroughly without the capacity for genuine argument. He wrote about a book he had been reading. He wrote about the August rain that had been falling on the Grosvenor Street garden for 3 days, and how it had turned the roses against the back wall a very deep and satisfying red. He wrote every day. He had told her he would, and he did. 7 weeks. Eleanor counted them not because she was counting, but because weeks have a shape to them, and she was aware, in the methodical way she was aware of most things, of the shape of this particular 7. She read his letters every morning at Agnes's kitchen table, before her aunt came downstairs, before the cat had been fed and the kettle put on. She read them slowly and with complete attention, which was how she read everything that mattered. She placed each letter, when she had finished, into the wooden box alongside the other things she had carried through the years. Her father's letters from the country rectory, the letters from friends in their own lives now, the pressed flowers from the garden that her father had sent her one autumn, because he thought they might make her smile. The wooden box was full now, in a way it had not been before. Agnes did not ask about the letters. She was, in Eleanor's experience, the finest practitioner she had ever encountered, of the art of being entirely present and entirely non-intrusive at once, which was a combination of qualities that was much rarer than it sounded, and which Eleanor valued above almost any other quality in a companion during a difficult time. Eleanor tended the garden and thought. She went into the village when she needed to, and she borrowed books from the lending library, and she had several genuinely satisfying conversations with the vicar's wife, who turned out to have an excellent mind that had been inadequately challenged for years, and who was visibly relieved to encounter someone willing to disagree with her properly. She taught herself the correct management of sweet peas on a trellis, and she learned the names of all Agnes's roses, and she helped repoint the front garden wall, where the mortar had crumbled over the winter. She was building a life. She had been building it since February, and she had not stopped building it since June, and she was not going to stop now, because a life that waited for permission to begin was not the kind she intended to have. She thought about the question he had asked, on his knees, in Agnes's garden with the grass, and the June afternoon, and the cat watching from a dignified distance. She thought about it carefully, and she thought about it honestly, and she did not let herself arrive at an answer before she had done both of those things thoroughly. She was not thinking about whether she loved him. That question had been answered for a long time, and the answer was clear, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. She was thinking about something more structural than that. She was thinking about what marriage was, and what it required, and what the specific marriage he was proposing would require, given everything that had passed between them, and everything that had not passed, and would need to still. She was thinking about the Dowager Duchess, who would always be his mother, and about what that relationship looked like from the inside now, and whether it had changed in ways that would hold. She was thinking about the estate, and the debt, and the practical realities of what he was managing, and what that would mean for the life they would build together, and she was honest about all of it, including the parts that were uncertain. She was also thinking about the letters. She was thinking about what kind of man writes an honest letter every day for 7 weeks, without making any of those letters a performance, or an argument for a particular outcome. She was thinking about what it meant that he had written about the Grosvenor Street garden in the rain, and about Beatrice's assessment of Miss Warren's argumentative limitations, and about a book he had disagreed with, and about the specific quality of an August evening when the light came through the study windows at a particular angle, and none of it was designed to be impressive, and all of it was real. She was thinking about what kind of person says, on their knees in a borrowed garden, that they are not asking you to save anything, that they are asking because their life is different when you are in it, and says it in the plain, direct way of someone who has decided to stop being a coward about it. In the 5th week she went for a walk in the early morning, before Agnes was up, through the Charlbury fields in the August light, which was warm and clear and cast long shadows through the hedgerows. She walked for an hour and a half, and she thought, and when she came back to the cottage, she sat at the kitchen table, and Agnes, who had appeared by then with the kettle and 2 cups, set one in front of her, and sat down across from her, and looked at her niece's face, with the thorough attention she had given it all, Eleanor's life. "Well?" Agnes said. Eleanor looked at her. "I am going to say yes," she said. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. "Are you certain?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I have been thinking about it properly for 7 weeks, and I am certain." "What made you certain?" Agnes said. Eleanor thought about this. She thought about the letters, and the garden, and the grass on his trousers, and the way he had said her name on the chapel steps in Hanover Square. Just her name, with everything behind it. She thought about the library in December, and the fire, and the hours in January, when both of them had stopped being careful, and said what was true. She thought about the fact that the most consistent quality he had shown across the whole of everything that had happened, from the evening in the library to the morning on the chapel steps, was the quality of being willing to be honest when honesty cost him something. "He has been honest," she said, "even when it was not useful, especially then." Agnes looked at her for a moment more. Then she nodded. "Good," she said, and went to start breakfast. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of September, Eleanor sat at Agnes's kitchen table, in the early light, with her cup of tea, and her writing paper. She picked up her pen. She wrote one word. She folded the page and sealed it, and addressed it, and handed it to Agnes to take to the village post at 11 o'clock. Then she went out to the garden in the September morning, which was warm and clear, and smelled of turned earth, and the last of the summer roses, and she worked in the beds for an hour, and she felt the particular lightness of having made a decision she had been weighing carefully for a long time, and finally sat down. Agnes came back from the post. She said nothing, only looked at Eleanor's face, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a piece of news and is pleased by what it has turned out to be, and then she went inside to start lunch. The letter arrived at the Grosvenor Street house on a Wednesday morning. Edward was at his desk when Morton brought the post in, and among the letters was one in Eleanor's hand. He looked at it for a moment before he opened it. He unfolded the single page. One word. Yes. He sat very still for a long time. He was aware of the study around him, and the morning outside the windows, and the sound of the city going about its ordinary business, and he was aware of all of these things from a considerable distance, because most of him was occupied with a single written word on a single page. Then he put the letter inside his coat and went to find George Pemberton. George received the news at his own desk, in his own house, in St. James, and said, simply and entirely sincerely, that he was very glad. He stood and shook Edward's hand, and said it again, and the simplicity and completeness of his gladness was the most welcome thing Edward had encountered in several months. James Edward Ashford was born on the 15th of October, in Agnes Hartley's spare room in Charlbury, in full autumn sunshine, delivered by the Charlbury village doctor at 11:30 in the morning. He arrived with considerable energy and strong opinions about the immediate world, both of which were entirely consistent with the character he would develop over the following years. The doctor said he was healthy and well-formed and strong, which was confirmed by everything he did in the next 5 minutes. Agnes held him while the doctor attended to Eleanor, and the cat sat in the doorway with the proprietary air of someone who considers this room to be personally under their protection. The October light came through the window warm and gold, and the garden outside was late season and still, and Eleanor lay in the spare room bed and breathed and thought, "This is real, and I am equal to it." Edward arrived at the cottage the next morning. He had been at the inn, in the village, for 3 days, at Eleanor's request, close enough to be reached immediately, but far enough to give her the privacy of the berth itself. Agnes brought him upstairs and opened the door, and he stood in the doorway of the spare room, in his traveling coat, with his hat in his hands, and he looked at Eleanor in the bed, and at the child wrapped beside her, and he was quiet for so long that Eleanor said, "Come in." He came in. He looked at the child for a moment, with an expression that Eleanor filed carefully in the part of her mind that kept the things she wanted to be able to find again. She held James out to him. He took him with the careful, inexperienced hands of someone who has thought seriously about how to do this, and is determined to do it correctly. He held James against his chest and looked down at the small face and was very still. "James," Eleanor said. "I thought James, if that suits you." "James," he said, as if weighing the word and finding it exactly right. He looked up at her. "Yes." A pause. "Thank you. For all of it. For every part." "Sit down," she said. "You look as though you might fall over." He sat in the chair Agnes had placed by the bed, and he held his son, and the three of them were in the small room in the October morning, and it was the first quiet moment they had shared since December, and it was better than any of the ones before it. They were married the following spring, on a Wednesday morning in April, at the village church in Charlbury. No grand ceremony, no assembled society, no elaborate arrangements or white roses or hundreds of guests. Agnes Hartley, George Pemberton, and Lady Beatrice Ashford, who arrived from Surrey carrying without being asked a small bunch of early garden flowers, tied with kitchen string, because she had decided this was better than anything that could be purchased. The vicar at the Charlbury church had been in the village for 20 years and performed the service with the warm efficiency of a man who loves his work and has never been made tired by it. The April morning was clear and cool, and the Oxfordshire spring was exactly what it was every year, pale green and smelling of new leaves, and full of birdsong from the hedges in the fields around the village. Eleanor wore a blue dress she had made herself. Blue suited her, and she was a practical woman who spent money where it mattered. She stood beside Edward in the small church, and said the words that needed saying, and he said them back, and the whole thing was quiet and true and genuinely theirs, and there were no steps to freeze on. James, 6 months old, attended in Agnes's arms. He regarded the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who is following events closely and reserving judgment. Beatrice held his hand during the quiet portions, and he was apparently satisfied with this arrangement and fell asleep during the final blessing, which the vicar took with the good humor of a man who understood that this was actually the best possible sign. George stood at the back of the church and thought, with the long, warm satisfaction of a man who has been a good friend to someone for 20 years and has watched them finally manage to be honest about what they needed. He had never seen Edward look so entirely like himself. After the service, they walked to Agnes's cottage for lunch, which lasted 3 hours because the conversation was good and nobody was in a hurry to be anywhere else. The afternoon light came long and golden over the Oxfordshire fields, and when the evening arrived, Agnes lit the lamps in the kitchen, and they sat around the table with their cups of tea, and Beatrice told everyone about a geographical theory she had been developing, which she had decided was entirely correct and wanted to defend against challenge. And Eleanor challenged it, and they were arguing about it for 40 minutes with complete pleasure, while Edward listened, and James slept in George's arms in the corner chair, and Agnes's cat arranged itself on the windowsill in the evening light. The Ashford estate recovered, slowly and without drama, through careful management and cleared debt and decisions made on the basis of what was true rather than what was comfortable. And it was a real recovery rather than a borrowed one. And Edward found that the slowness of it was better than the quick fix he had once been seeking, because it required him to understand what he was managing rather than merely paper over the difficulty. He and his mother arrived, eventually, at a new kind of understanding. It required time and several honest conversations that were not comfortable, and it produced something that was genuine without being simple, which was the only kind of thing between them that could last. She was not a villain. She had done what she believed the family required, and she had been comprehensively wrong about the means, and both of those things were true simultaneously and needed to be carried together, which was something he learned to do. Beatrice grew up arguing about everything and being curious about everything and treating Eleanor with the fond directness she had brought to the first geography lesson, and treating James as simultaneously a nuisance and the best possible companion for any occasion. She never quite lost the habit of arriving 5 minutes early for whatever she was supposed to be doing, and she retained through her adult life an absolute inability to tolerate a lesson that did not take the mind of the student seriously. The library at Ashford Hall remained cold in the evenings. They both still went there. They still argued about books and ideas and the way the world was changing, and neither of them had the slightest interest in the arguments becoming easier, because the difficulty was where the substance lived. Eleanor kept the wooden box. It held the letters now, all of them. Her father's letters from the country rectory, the careful handwriting of a man who believed in the value of telling people true things clearly. The letters from friends, scattered into other lives. 7 weeks of letters from a man who had learned, later than he should have, to stop managing the truth of what he felt and simply say it. She had told him he was right about the Thackeray. He had said she was right about Thackeray, about Dickens, about honesty and impropriety, about most things. He had said it clearly and without reservation. She had said she knew. He had said, "You have always known. It is one of the most infuriating things about you." She had said, "Thank you." And they had argued about it for 20 minutes, with complete pleasure, in the cold library, with the fire low and Ashford Hall quiet around them. And it was exactly what it had always been, which was the most real thing in either of their lives.